Dr. Kadali is now the founding convener of the Autonomous Research Institute for Direct Democracy and Social Ecology, and he's the author of 3 books, Internationalism, Pan-Africanism, and the Struggle of Social Classes, Pan-African Social Ecology, and the subject of today's talk, Intimate Direct Democracy, Fort Mose, the Great Dismal Swamp, and the Human Quest for Freedom. He's taught at universities all over the world, in South Africa, in Georgia. He's now retired from Savannah State University. Let's give Modibo a big welcome.
Oh, that's a nice group. Aha. Okay, but I'd like to know some things about you. Because as mentioned before, I've written a couple, 2 or 3 books. I've written about 4 of them, but my 5th one will be coming out in the fall. And I hope I'm invited next time to come to this gathering. As I understand it, this is the 17th gathering, and the 18th gathering should be next year. Or wherever it is, I'd like to be there in person. So I'd like to apologize for not being there on this occasion. Now, my first book was written by a young activist who was trying to figure out who the hell he was. This was in 1974, 75, when the last upheaval in America was beginning to ebb. And I was trying to figure out what the hell had happened, along with other people. I've written many other essays, but my second book was called Pan-Africanism and Social Ecology. Now, that was an effort to hook up some divergent elements in the revolutionary struggle as it was progressing at that time. Because social ecology was not a part of the Black Power movement. Pan-Africanism was not a part of the ecological movement. It was necessary to put those together so that we can see where we are. And I don't know if we've bridged that gap yet. So I'd like to ask a couple of questions. And by the way, I'm at my best, as we all are, when we're talking to one another. So there should be a robust question and answer period at the end of this little presentation. Now, what I'd like to do is give you and ask you, how many of y'all are familiar with the work of C.L.R. James? Okay, all right. How many of y'all are familiar with the work of George Padmore?
You have a lot of raised hands.
Yeah, well, I can see some of them. I can't, thanks for telling me, I can see some of them. Okay, how many of y'all are familiar with the work, the 19th century work of W.E.B. Du Bois? 19th century work. I don't mean the 20th century stuff. How many of y'all believe that George Washington Carver was a ecologist? Have you ever heard of it? Okay, well, keep those names in mind for the Q&A session. I would like to look at my approach to things so we can understand what it is. I call myself a critical historiographer. The assumptions of a critical historiographer is that at every juncture in human history, there have been direct democratic social movements. Number 2, these movements have been ignored in the history of human social development. Number 3, the hierarchical little mini states that occur all across the Eurasian Peninsula and to some extent in the Americas are the ones that are emphasized along with their hierarchical leaders. You know about Montezuma, you know about Genghis Khan, you know about Caesar, you know all about these, you know about King Tut and all of these people. To a critical historiographer, these people are insignificant. They're simply the people who were pushed up by their own times. That's all. Critical historiography looks at the development of the vast network and the vast carpet of directly democratic societies that has existed across the world from 20,000 BC to the present period. Number four, the critical historiography looks at direct democracy under your feet. In other words, during the segregation period, Black people created all kinds of directly democratic community organizations which have not been even looked at. And that's what we're trying to do, to point you all in that direction so we can understand what the hell we're doing here. I mean, I'm guilty of it too. Hierarchical understanding of history is so ingrained in us, we miss what our grandparents had done. I grew up in a Geechee community named Crossroads. I didn't know that it was directly democratically organized. I really didn't know that. I grew up in the early Baptist church. There are elements of direct democracy in that. Now, of course, that's changed, but in the early 1940s and the 30s, they were democratic institutions, especially in the rural South. That needs to be looked at. So what I'm telling you right now is that we got a lot of work to do. We got an awful lot of work to do. Now, in my book, which is the topic that I'm supposed to be discussing today, let me make sure I understand the topic. Wait a minute. I've got it written down here somewhere. Wait just a second. Oh, here it is. I'm supposed to walk you through counter histories of autonomy and free and face-to-face democracy in the periphery of empire by self-emancipated slaves and indigenous people in the Americas. Well, I'd like to change that just a little bit. Instead of just using slaves, I'd like to use enslaved people, because these people, in many respects, were free already when they were brought here. And I claim that heritage myself. But these people were enslaved. They were taken away from Africa, where their society has developed, and they were put here in America as enslaved people, not because they were ignorant and dumb and stupid, but because they understood the agricultural commodities that needed to be developed in the United States, namely tobacco and rice. That's what they wanted. They wanted tobacco and rice farmers. So they went to Africa and got them. The other thing that I want to say is that the indigenous people of America were already beginning to organize themselves in small hierarchical nodes, but these are not the basic ideas that we should be looking at. We should be looking at the vastly democratic flat societies that already existed in the United States of America when the European hierarchical societies, under the motivation of mercantile capitalism, came in contact with them in the first place. And so I want y'all to kind of cast y'all's eyes in that kind of direction so you can begin to understand what we need to do, in my estimation. Now, this book that was just published called The Quest, well, it's about the Great Dismal Swamp and Fort Mosaic, two historical sites that I studied. One is in North Carolina, the Great Dismal Swamp. It stands astride what is now North Carolina and the southeastern Virginia border. You can go there, it's a state park. It looks very innocent. It looks like almost nothing ever happened there. But this, when the United States of America was first being formed, was a place where people who did not submit to slavery ran to and created societies, directly democratic societies, which now are just beginning to be studied. There's another place that I mentioned in the book called Fort Mosaic. In the Spanish-held territories, what was happening there is that slaves were escaping the rice plantation and going south to St. Augustine and to Florida, not just St. Augustine, but throughout Florida. And they were settling in communities which were made up of enslaved, formerly enslaved people because they were freed then, and native people. And they were creating all kinds of creative democratic societies that essentially are just now beginning to be studied. And so that's what I do in the Great Dismal Swamp study, as well as the Fort Mose study. And I don't like to talk long because I can get carried away just like everybody else, you know. So what I would like to do, Mason, if possible, and I just have one more little thing to say. Okay. Your generation, I'm glad that y'all are young. I can see that. I'm older than y'all. I'm older than most of y'all. I celebrated my 80th birthday 2 months ago. I'm in good shape though, you know, I'm doing all right. But your generation are beginning to answer these questions through the study and the quest for direct democracy. You're gonna see it everywhere. And the little thing that I wanted to say, I think that people misunderstand this direct democracy thing. I don't think our role is to create it. No, we're not in the business of creating directly democracy society. We're simply in the business of recognizing when we see it. Because many of us are so deep in it, you know, when you're in shit, you can't see much. So y'all gonna have to recognize these democratic tendencies that are all around us and look at how they are developing. Some are developing to be less democratic, some are developing to be more democratic. But the United States of North America, the Republic of the United States, for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with justice for all, never existed. It never will exist. As a matter of fact, it destroyed the democracy in its midst among the native people and captured whatever goes going on in Africa and brought it here. And to say that the American government, the American Republican form of democracy is the beacon of the future when they were created by slave owners is just bullshit on its face. And we need to call it out again and again and again, wherever we see it. So with that, let's engage. Let's engage.
Hello. I wanted to thank you for coming. My name is Rosewater. My family is actually from Peanut Country, just north of the Great Dismal Swamp. So hearing about your book, it made me, I very much want to read it. But at the beginning, you mentioned that in the past, like Black churches in the rural South were like primarily directly democratic organizations, but that's changed. And I'm really curious if you could elaborate on how that change occurred from your understanding, because that's a really interesting piece of history that I haven't really heard about before.
Well, that's a good question. It's not democratic now because the banks got control of the building funds. But at first, the ex-slaves congregated up under a tree, up under some gathering place. And it's amazing to me how the AME church never really expanded to the rural South. The AME church expanded in the urban South, primarily because it was hierarchical. The AME church had bishops and all kind of people. But the Baptist church had deacons, and the preacher was called. As a matter of fact, I remember when I was 12, 13 years old, that was the first vote I cast to see whether the preacher would stay or not. Now, that's the way it was in some places, but that was eroded through state creep. In other words, as time went on and more authoritarian type preachers saw the opportunity to make some money, and they saw the collusion with the bankers to make more money and to build bigger and bigger shrines, then the state creep took over, and you have now authoritarian churches both in the rural and the urban South. But it didn't start off that way. It did not start off that way. I'm talking about the Baptist church, who was formed by ex-slaves in their own communities. That's what I'm talking about. Now keep in mind that these institutional relations come and go. They're not permanent. You have to look at it in a certain context, just as you look at all social formations within the context which gave them rise. And if you try to make a universal declaration about the nature of any of the institutions, you're going to get caught in some metaphysical nonsense, and it will trap you. That's what I say sometimes. This is a question that will help us understand the relationship between Pan-Africanism and social ecology. Now, there's classical Pan-Africanism, which is status. These are the ones who wanted Black people to have some kind of state, some kind of government, like the Republic of New Africa, or the Republic of this, or the Republic of that. And it's read early in Nkrumahism is classical Pan-Africanism. Garveyism is classical Pan-Africanism. C.L.R. James represents a neo-Pan-Africanism. That is a stateless Pan-Africanism. So Pan-Africanism changes. So you got to watch these concepts, because these concepts can trap you. Like a lot of my black friends are still trapped in classical Pan-Africanism and Afrocentrism. They trapped there too. They haven't moved from that period.
So I would like to say thank you for coming, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. My understanding of Baptist AME, because I'm initially from Kentucky.
Okay.
Right. My grandparents migrated from Alabama, right, running away from, captivity. So first and foremost, when we talk about church, for me, especially when we're talking about Baptists, I think it's more of a conditioning, more of a mindset as far as getting people to buy in to a system that programs you to accept what is, right? Even though, like you said, none of this stuff really exists. My understanding, and once again, please correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that everything that has been brought forth to us from slavery to current is that we're supposed to accept a system that Western civilization has said this is right and this is wrong, right? We're supposed to buy into, and I don't want to get too deep into spiritual, but I do want to simply say, without offense, is that my whole thing is that religion, government, all of it is BS, right?
Now, I'm an atheist. I told you that I grew up in the church, but the church is a structural entity, but it also has a grave ideological component. And I'm talking about what existed back in the 30s. This is almost 100 years later. The church now, to me, is irrelevant, and the ideological concepts that it preaches are irrelevant. But the other thing I want to say is that enslaved people really never accepted that. They tried to. You can see the struggle in the cultural of that time now. We can look back at it and come to our own conclusion. But the enslaved people were running away. They were using the encoded messages from the church to facilitate their escape. They were struggling against it. I mean, and I'm just looking at the structure of the church as it existed almost 100 years ago in the Baptist variety only. That's all I'm saying.
Hello? Yeah. My name is Roberto Mendoza. My grandfather was a Baptist minister. And our people, the Muskogee, we were part of the so-called Trail of Tears.
Yes.
And we were from Georgia and Alabama originally. And as far as I can look at the history, the Cherokees and the Muskogee people especially, when colonization started happening, we figured out, wrongly of course, well, we couldn't blame ourselves back then, but we thought that if we adapted and assimilated into the European white culture, maybe they would leave us alone. But of course that didn't happen. And in fact, despite us becoming Baptists and despite us adopting the kind of top-down hierarchical governing systems of, instead of our direct democracy that we had, we had the House of Warriors and House of Kings, something like that. But despite that, Andrew Jackson, who was the president, and despite the fact that the Supreme Court said we couldn't be removed, and he said, well, let them the justices made the decision, let them enforce it. When they rounded us all up, shipped us off at gunpoint in the wintertime, a quarter of our people died, of course, and we ended up in Oklahoma. But I noticed that among black people and Native people both, we both tried to assimilate to protect ourselves. And the Western tribes, to a certain extent, they didn't do that, take that path, but they realized they had to accept the reservation system or else they would be completely wiped out. So the choices we made back then were because, we thought the best way to survive. The one aspect of that about Native people was that a lot of academics, I remember I went to an event where the white people were talking about slavery, and they said, oh, the Native people had slavery too. And they enslaved black people. And I had to explain, the history of that is that a lot of white traders started intermarrying with our people, with the women, Native women, precisely to obtain access to our land. And once they had that land, they wanted to be like the white plantation owners and make money. And the only way they could make a lot of money was to have slaves. So white folks introduced slavery into our culture, or into our people. We never had it as a part of our culture or our values, because we all practiced subsistence farming. So I just want to let people know that, yes, our tribes had slaves, but it wasn't something that we voluntarily adapted. A lot of our tribal members refused that and tried to rebel against those kind of ideas, but they were outnumbered and anyway, we did not inherently believe in slavery. It was introduced to us. And it was introduced, like I say, to white traders mainly, who came in and married our women precisely so that they could make money off of slavery.
Even African Americans owned slaves, especially around the New Orleans area in Louisiana. Oftentimes, Native Americans in Florida, I read stories where when they were rounding up slaves, when the slave catchers were trying to round up slaves, the Native people, the Seminoles and the Creeks, and it's hard to determine who was who, they would basically say that these are my slaves, you can't take them. And they use that as a ruse just to keep the people free. So they use all kind of little tricks and things to evade being re-enslaved or to evade hierarchical society and to create a society where people can live in harmony regardless of race. I mean, that's the legacy of Florida. People lived in Fort Mose, which is right outside of St. Augustine, north of St. Augustine. The people in St. Augustine, the Spanish soldiers at the time were from Iberia, and they were from Morocco and places like that. They were dark-skinned people. So it was hard to tell who was who and what was what. But it's interesting to study. But we need to study it institutionally and see how it developed and how it changed and how the laboring people got rid of it. And that's why they had a civil war in the United States of North America. The people refused to abide by slavery. The slaves freed themselves. The plantation system in the South was, the South in the United States was untenable by 1860. And so it was a desperate attempt by the plantation owners to hold on to them in the face of them continuing to leave the plantation. So that's an example of resistance and the direct democratization. I mean, they left the plantation, refused to work. Du Bois called it a general strike. And Abraham Lincoln had no other choice. Further questions?
First, I want to welcome you, brother, and to thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
You know, I'm an anarchist, and in the anarchist movement, they only want to talk about what happened in Europe and this, that, and the other, and the ideas that, and so forth. So I wanted you to lay out some of the indigenous forms of direct democracy as well as those in Africa.
Well, I mean, during the segregation period, people were looking at this thing out of one eye, and that is the laws of the central government. But all the time, especially in some of the urban sections of the South in particular, people were creating direct democratic institutions around the church and around the neighborhood. And even in my community of Crossroads and Riceboro, these Geechee communities, they were self-organized and governed. Actually, we voted. For a long time, I couldn't understand what the voting issue was up in Georgia and Mississippi. So what I saw, excuse me, is my mother and father are not from coastal Georgia. They're from central Georgia. But I grew up in coastal Georgia and I was born in Savannah. So of these, the remnants of these people who had occupied the land as a result of the Field Order 15 of General Sherman during the early Reconstruction period, or right at the end of the Civil War, large numbers of Black people had taken over the land and were working it themselves. Some people came and took the land back, but a large numbers of Black people still had the land in their hands when I was there, when I was born. So you had these direct democratic communities up and down the coast of Georgia and South Carolina called Geechees. And it's unstudied. You know, people can't see it. It's just, I mean, you got to know where to look to find what you want to see. You know, so, and by the way, that's a part of the dialectic too. The dominant aspect of the dialectic hides the recessive aspect sometimes. So the recessive aspect has to assert itself so that other people can see it. Just like the whole myth of, see, when you make a statement, any statement, like for instance, Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. Okay, that's a statement. Abraham Lincoln did not free the slaves. So you say, okay, Abraham Lincoln did not free the slaves. So what are you going to say? You don't ask, you don't let it end there. When somebody lies to you, they're not lying to you because they don't like you or they're hostile to you. They're lying to you because they're trying to hide something that you need to know. So you have to look at under that and figure out what is the recessive aspect of the dialectic so you can understand what you need to know. So what we really need to know is that slaves freed themselves. Abraham Lincoln didn't have a damn thing to do with it. He had no other choice. He was put in that position. And that's how state policy works. State policy is the response to a social movement from below that the state is trying to legitimize and contain that. And that's what state policy is. State policy is never the solution to anything. It is simply the affirmation that there's a hell of a struggle going on that you need to be looking at. You see, there's other instances of it. Many slaves actually ran away. and created alternative society. Many black people ran away from the sharecropping farm in the rural areas and attempted to create alternative societies which they govern themselves, like Mount Bayou in Mississippi. That needs to be studied. The vast migration of the former sharecroppers to creating them towns during the Reconstruction period all over Oklahoma and Kansas. My first teaching job was in a little place called Langston, Oklahoma, a black town. But it was formed right after the Reconstruction period by people who were trying to govern themselves and get away. That's an example of autonomy and self-governance. Now there's a struggle, you know, who runs this, who runs that, but that has to be worked out internally. I hope I was of help. I didn't want to confuse
you. That was right on the money, my brother, right on the money.
Well, so you touched on my question a bit just now, but I kind of was hoping you could just provide more background. Like, I haven't read the book yet, but I heard you interviewed before. Shout out to the Seriously Wrong podcast. And I just thought your work was so interesting. And I'm wondering if you can speak to more about like the demographics of the Maroon communities. Like, was it mostly, like you said, people who were enslaved and kind of freed themselves, or were there other kind of misfits from society that gravitated to these communities?
Yes, they were. And these communities were racially mixed. They call themselves Maroon, and you assume that they're black, just like you call themselves Seminoles, and that you thought that they were Indian. The Seminoles were a multiracial mixture of people in Florida, which fled the slavery and the oppression by other people. It could have been lesbians there, it could have been white people from the Piney Grove there. These were misfits, as you so aptly put them. Now, when they wanted their land, they had to get rid of them. So the American government made those people Indians so that they could remove them. You see, and that was a direct response. That was a policy response to something that the state needed in the face of these creative people trying to live on their own authority. Because if you say, well, okay, they're the Seminole tribe, blah, 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 you've accepted that definition of history, and you're certainly not critical. And we must be critical of every instance of authority that we face, every incident. Even what your parents, even what I'm telling you right now, even what your parents tell you. And you got to be critical of it all, and you got to redefine that stuff so you can understand what the hell you're doing. Otherwise, you fall right back into the dogmatic bullshit that traps you.
Hi, I have, thank you so much for being here and for your work. I have more of a sharing about experiences in trying to do Maroonage today in the context that we're in, and then debates that arise among other leftists about it. And I'm so curious about your thoughts. 20 years ago in North Carolina, we began what we called a quilombo, which is a Bantu word for Maroon society from the Southern Cone, from Brazil, in Durham, North Carolina. And it was urban-based, and we understood ourselves. A lot of us were students at Duke University and UNC Chapel Hill at the time, and were organizing with the Black community in Durham and undocumented migrants that were arriving in Durham from Mexico and Central America. And to create an assembly, we created a social center, and the assembly got to decide, of course, what it is that we were going to do. And it was mid-2000s, and so there wasn't a lot of internet back then. So one of our programs was to have an internet cafe. We had homework help, we had a community garden, and a lot of political education. And it was really interesting. A couple things. One is that whenever we would meet people from the Southern Cone, particularly from Argentina, even though they were leftists, when they heard the word quilombo, they are like, ooh, why do you call yourselves that? That means it's a big old mess. That's like a nasty place. which is how they've been taught about these maroon societies. They're just chaotic and nasty, right? And so we realized that the level of political education on that among the left on maroon societies was very, very small. And for sure, like for a lot of us, we were just discovering it back then. We thought it was really inspirational because it gave us a possibility to escape in place, which is a bit, I suppose, different from the past. So many of us are now forced into urban spaces. Cities, modern cities, are extremely ecologically devastating to the countryside, which was a big contradiction that we had as well. We had a hard time going into the countryside, one, because we didn't have money to access land. Today, many of us have land bases, but we're surrounded by a lot of MAGA. It's not very safe if you're black or brown to be out in the wilderness, in the countryside. But we're doing it anyway while connecting it to the city and understanding that we need to have new relationships between the city and the countryside that are ecologically sound and that are in right relation with each other. So as we've been conducting these experiments through, the Quilombo in Durham is no longer around, and a lot of us have moved to different places to continue the work in other ways. But it's interesting to talk about maroonage with other leftists because their understanding of geography is that in order to flee the dominant society, the dominant world, that we have to go get land and containerize it all over again, kind of like a nation state, which is very difficult to do, especially in the new territorialization of surveillance and property and all of that. And so our experiments today are doing it in a networked fashion that is kind of in plain sight, some of it is underground. But I love so much, and a lot of us love so much, the black radical impulse, particularly of fugitivity, of flight, of not accepting the horrible options that we're given. And so are trying to think of how can we do that in any place that we live, and the democratic practices that you were talking about. I'm so interested to learn more about what you said. There, you know, when you're in the shit and you're surrounded by shit, it's really hard to see that there's all of this, I don't know, you can call it beauty or light all around, but we need to learn to see what those practices are in our everyday lives. It's something that has, you know, for us, a lot of us come from undocumented migrant backgrounds, Native American backgrounds, who are taught to hate our culture, ourselves, and that we, the children with papers, were better, quote unquote, than our parents and our community. And so then we were taught in these schools that there's nothing to learn from our parents or our grandparents or our communities. But in studying the maroon societies and the quilombos, obviously, then it's been actually quite healing to get to see your own community all over again with new eyes, with those beautiful practices that, of course, have a lot of contradictions, but that are there. And so, yeah, just wanted to share that with you about these debates happening right now on the left, that it's impossible to flee. And also, if you might elaborate a bit about some democratic practices that maybe we can all, that we might be able to learn to see in our everyday lives once we leave this space, or maybe even in this space. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Let me give you an example in my own experience. I grew up in a community near Riceboro, Georgia, called Crossroads. It had 3 Baptist churches, 3 grocery stores, 2 owned by black people, 1 owned by a white guy. And this elementary school, well, the training school, the high school right there, and the 2 graveyards. So it had a legacy. People understood that they were living in a multi-generational situation. Down the road, there was a place called Briar Bay. And it's made up of a family called the LeCounts. The LeCounts are some black people that live on the same land that their plantation owned by a white LeCount from the colonial period. And you go up and down the road, there's Freddie LeCount and Jackson LeCount and Howard LeCount. They all live there. They still right in front of us. Now they're having a family reunion next week, as a matter of fact. It's their 15th family reunion. And there's you eat the barbecue and you drink the corn liquor and you have a good time. But now we're beginning to document this and their old people and the stories that they have to tell. And to go down into the plantation where the white family lived, and they regarded that as a haunted place, the older people. So now what we're trying to, and by the way, this community has a leadership structure. It's got the Uncle Tom leadership structure, who the white people put in place, and a radical leadership structure, which is popular in nature. And so what happens is, this Uncle Tom structure, they live in bigger houses. The radical structure live in smaller houses, but they are developing into more houses. But the point is that this is a living community of people, which it predates the country itself. But nobody's looking at it. I couldn't even see it. Hell, I know all these people, and I didn't get it. I got some of it now, but I'm working on it. I'm working on it. But I mean, you see people right there. I mean, I grew up with these people, and I'm trying to figure out what's going on here. So we have to be very, very vigilant to figure out what goes on. There's another little point I want to make before we leave, and this is the question that we all need to solve. We all need to figure out and work on. That is the role of the historical moment where spontaneity breaks down the old order spontaneously. What does that mean? Is that a creative moment or is that a destructive moment? To me, it's a creative moment. But most times people look at that as very destructive and chaos and anarchistic. Then there's something else. Well, we can see it again. Why is the Great Dismal Swamp called the Great Dismal Swamp? It is a place of dismal, wild, crazy shit that goes on that the missionaries and the white people from Europe didn't understand. But the native people understood it very well. It's not dismal to them. And the new people who came into the swamp or from escaping the plantations, the tobacco plantations primarily, they saw this as a place of great liberation and freedom. But yet, the state of North Carolina called the area the Great Dismal Swamp State Park. So it's all very interesting. Oh, the other thing I want to mention, the Fort Mose, that was created by black people, local black people, not the anthropologists, but local black people using their own law and resurrecting that and getting a grant and putting it there. Now it's a state park, but it was initiated by local black people.
Okay, so I guess you guys can hear me?
I hear you.
So there's these, ongoing debates between, like, quote unquote anarchists and Marxist-Leninists about the path forward, right? And so I think ultimately that debate is really around control of land, because, like, I think the Marxist-Leninists think that you have to seize control of the state in order to actually control the land base, right? Like, if you were to have an autonomous society, you need land, and then if there's a state that's surrounding it, they're always going to be encroaching upon that land to try to take it from you or kill you or whatever. Which a lot of Maroons had to kind of hide in order to do that. And the previous speaker was talking about how, the idea of hiding or fleeing is impossible given the sort of size and power of the surveillance state that exists now in terms of technology and so forth. So, what would you say to these, Marxist-Leninists who think like the only way forward is seizing the state, and how do we actually achieve autonomous structures that aren't state-based, given the conditions we're talking about in terms of the all-seeing eye and so forth? Thanks.
Yeah. Number one, the nation state is not necessarily based upon land as the only means of production in place. The nation state is a capitalist creation which protects domestic markets and governs the terms of production and sale by a representative government, technically like a Republican form of government, which is ruled by a minority of people in a Senate or a House or a Knesset or Parliament or some other means like that. Now, the way I see the long-term dismantlement of these big states, because they are the enemies of everybody. I mean, they're the ones who have the armies, they have the navies, the air force, they're the ones who develop these policies that destroy the earth and protect the capitalists that degrade the environment all over the world. And keep in mind that they are warlike. They can't exist in peace. So they configure and reconfigure, and then they fight. Then they fight and reconfigure and try to confuse everybody on whether or not this is the free world and that's the communist world, etc. Like, so they go through that every so many times during a century. Now, what we need to do is help, not create. The masses will create these institutions. And that's why that spontaneity is so important. When these crises occur, and I've heard people call these the opportunistic historical moments, you have to be ready to recognize and work with the masses as they begin to develop their own institutions through which they will rule locally and connect with others like that. And that's a very delicate, skilled process that we all have to learn to do. But it has to take place through the dismantlement of the centralized bureaucracy by local entities. It has to do that. And the local entities where there are black people, the majority are black. Where the entities are white people, they're majority white. Where they're native people, the majority is native. The point is that everybody has to develop a responsible citizenship and understand what they must do. And we must understand what we are and what we must observe and work with and see them do. And so that's the way I see us building directly democratic organizations. Like, for instance, I want to plug our little bookstore in Stone Mountain, Georgia. Stone Mountain, used to be the headquarters of the Ku Klux Klan. And if y'all down there in Atlanta and in Stone Mountain, go by the community bookstore on the main street in the village at the foot of the mountain, on the side that you can walk up on. You see a lot of books in there. But we are trying to develop, along with the locally constituted city government, a sensitive group of people that can at least influence and help people understand how directly democratic institutions already exist in various places. We need to bring them together and understand what they are, work with young people to get them to understand it. And you just have to do that hard work. And you have to do that writing so people can get it in their minds of what it is, what we're doing. It's very delicate, and it has nothing to do with the vanguard party, which will seize the government for the people and usher in a new society where the workers will rule under the dictatorship of the proletariat. That stuff is out. That stuff is really outlived its usefulness now. Your generation must refashion and re-understand what's going on with that. That stuff is, when somebody comes to you talking that nonsense, just walk away. Don't waste your time trying to convince them of anything, because it's futile. It's futile. Or if there's somebody who's saying, what we must do is develop a state run by black people. No. All what we must do is develop a state. Just ask them the question. If you want 5 states in the United States, what's that going to do to the Creek Native people? What's that going to do with the Cherokee? They were here before you were. So what the hell are you talking about? So all this idiotic stuff that is contained within the understanding of the nation state as the liberatory mechanism has outlived its usefulness, even if it had usefulness at the point of its origin. So that's how I see developing these alternative institutions. And also, I can't tell you what they might look like in your practice. You might see them and I might not be able to see them. And I don't want to be mystical or anything, but if you know your area and know what's going on, if I'm in Oklahoma, if I'm in Arizona, I might be able to see some things if you ask me, you know. But down in Georgia, down in local Georgia, down in Harris Neck, I know it. I know the people who are doing it. You know, and as time goes on, people begin to understand it more and more and more and more. And it's a long-term, sensitive, brave, and critical process. You know, a very humbling process. Very, very humbling. And also, you should keep your health up so you can witness some of it, because you're going to see some stuff in your life. And I hope you're able to understand what you're seeing. It's very tragic. The greatest tragedy I've seen is somebody standing right in the front of what the masses are doing, and they're condemning them. No analysis. They just go, well, you can't do that. You can't do this. What are you doing? Where's your leader? Take me to your leader. Who's in charge? That kind of nonsense.
I have a question for you about social ecology and what that word means to you.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, leave it at that. What does, you know, because you've done a lot to expand that concept, and I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah. Well, social ecology, I grew up in the countryside, and I learned to swim in various creeks and swamps and stuff. And those things never was hostile to me, though I never hunted and killed other animals or fish. So I grew up roaming the woods and gathering, you know, not mushrooms. We didn't eat mushrooms, but we did eat blackberries and berries like that. So whoever I meet and with my children, I try to get them, even though they are urban in their background, try to get them to understand that they are part of the natural world. Their physical bodies are simply an extension of the natural world, which nurtures them along with everybody else. And just get them to understand that we have to pay homage. Like, for instance, when we say grace, we don't say grace. Before we eat, we acknowledge the people who gather the food and who bring the food to us, and understanding and affirming that we're part of the natural world on a living planet that circles a living star. So what I try to do is incorporate that into the family rituals that I have something to say about. Like if they're in my house, that's what we say. Then the other people can say what they want to say, but it's juxtaposed with Father God, we come to you for you to have mercy on us and bless this food. And it sounds ridiculous after I said what I said. You know? So I try to do that. So it's an intimate experience. And then when I go to meetings and there's one guy dominating the meeting and don't let nobody say anything, I try to say something, especially if it has to do with the ecology of the world, because it's all, you know, it's all part of the real world. And I applaud the Institute of Social Ecology. And of course, we look at intimate direct democracy as being a part of that, an integral part of it, and one can't do without the other. And I try to understand when I'm studying something, if I can't see the ecological dimension of it, then I'm not getting it. So I have to go and figure it out again so I can understand what the hell I'm doing right here.
Hi there, Madibo. I'm really grateful for you to be here. I was hoping that you could speak more about your personal experience. You know, seeing you as somebody who's a movement elder, who has a rich history of struggle and organizing himself. I wonder if you could speak to how your own thought and eventually like embracing a politics of direct democracy was shaped by your personal experience, struggling in the movement, wrestling with contradictions that came up through that work and experience, and what that journey looked like. I think that we could all benefit from hearing that from you. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I plan to do more of that tomorrow, but I can tell you this, that the Black Power movement was very disappointing to me in terms of its lack of democracy and the charismatic leadership worship that was taking place in that context was very disappointing to me. And the lack of ideological growth and development along with the male chauvinism, it was very, very disappointing to me. And, you know, I was purged from the league because those of us who advocated more democracy in the organization were summarily purged. And then they didn't give us a chance to really explain in detail our vision. And of course, 2 years later, the organization fell apart, as did most of those type of organizations. So that was a formative thing in Detroit back in 1970. It's known as the Easter Purges of 1970. And Detroit was a hell of a place then, man. It was, I mean, everybody was in motion. And then when we started organizing against the placement of Highland Park College and Highland Park High School on top of the Davidson Expressway, all kind of people started coming forward. And all I was doing is just trying to articulate and work with those people who were coming forward. So, I mean, the point is, you're in struggle like this and you can see things. And tomorrow, I plan to be on the panel with my colleagues and stuff. We can talk about that because they're all veterans of the Black Power movement.
Okay. Thank you very much for spending the time with us today.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, this question kind of follows up a little on what Abe asked, but I was wondering, you know, in 1921, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote a book about cooperatives in black cooperatives in American history as kind of a response to, you know, systematically, you know, excluded from the formal economy, emerging from, you know, enslavement. And in 2011, Jessica Gordon Nembhard wrote a kind of book similarly documenting cooperatives, black cooperatives in the 20th century. And I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit to the connection between cooperative economic structures and democracy and what we can learn from these experiences of Black Americans cooperating, and how, as advocates of direct democracy, we can be looking to that example as, you know, to informing our future politics.
Well, as you know, Du Bois formed the, well, did a study on the Philadelphia Negro in 1917. And he basically formed and was the pioneer in urban sociology, which he does not get credit for at all. But his approach was a scientific approach that they acknowledged class society among Black people and tried to be objective about it. Now, on your general question about the cooperative economics, that's really not new. The Grange and on the perimeter of the expansion of the western frontier, and the food co-ops and the co-op during the Reconstruction period on the coast of Georgia. All of these were the basis of direct democratic social formation. Who made decisions about that? There's a place, and I hate to see this sometimes, because when they do these historical markers, they always talk about some individual black person who was in correspondence with some white person who came up with this idea. But if you look at some of these historical markers, black people had these credit unions, these other kinds of cooperatives. Even when I was coming up, my father, who really was an inspirational figure to many people, we had a cooperative where they bought one tractor with the GI Bill money that they combined, and they used that tractor to break up the small farms of the former soldiers in the 1950s. And my father kept the tractor, so he kept the tractor in the yard, and they had to sign the tractor out. But that was a part of the general democracy that I was unable to see until recent times. But upon reflection, you can see that. And now, if you know more about the generalized scientific study of cooperatives among people, and I don't think it's a black-white phenomenon or any phenomenon, that oppressed people do form cooperative associations. The first labor movements with this, and if you look at the process of people trying to organize in the face of oppression, you know that they weren't sitting down, laying down, taking it. They were organizing and trying to fight against it. And so that resistance has always been there, and we need to identify it in our understanding of the history of just not only this nation state and this region, but the planet as a whole.
Alrighty, folks, lunch is ready. Thank you so much to our setup crew, and thank you so much, Modibo, for joining us for this amazing conversation. I really encourage you all to get your hands on a copy of some of his work. We just did a really incredible reading group for his latest book. And I also just point you towards another essay written by the father of one of the ISC's board members. His name is Russell Maroon Shoatz, political prisoner, Black Panther, and Black Liberation Army soldier on Maroon communities. And it's called The Dragon and the Hydra. And taking everything Modibo here is talking about, thinking through what this means for our movements that can be resilient and survive state repression. I think it's an important contribution to this conversation.
Thank you all, if y'all can hear me. Thank you for allowing me to be a part of the gathering. Okay?